Hello there. We are going to talk about routing in regards of Cerebral, but I'm going to talk about what we're doing wrong with the routing currently, uh, and how and why it works this way with Cerebral, and how it can work differently with other libraries also. Okay, so it's out. I think there's something wrong with how we do routing. And the reason I think that is because our way of building applications has matured so much, but the router is it doesn't fit in with the way we build applications today. And what I'm specifically talking about here is Flux. And Flux has like a view layer, and that's usually React. And then you have a controller layer, which handles the state changes. Normally that will be just a dispatcher, but it could be some action creators, or you might use something else. The thing is that this layer is responsible for handling the state changes. Very often it talks to the server or other things, and it dispatches changes into the model layer where you actually store these state changes. And then the view layer listens to the model layer and it will update itself. This is a really great way of thinking about building applications, and Cerebral works pretty much the same way. It's just that the controller layer has a larger role in the application. I won't go into those details because you can watch some other videos on that. But the thing is that the router doesn't really fit in with this. A traditional router kind of wraps your view layer, and whenever the URL changes, it dives straight into the view layer and does changes to it. It decides what components to mount. But you have another concept of deciding how the view layer should look, and that is your application state. It's the model layer. That is what decides what the view layer should look like. So now you have two different concepts handling or doing stuff to your view layer. And it's always better to have one concept instead of two, especially when they actually do the same thing. And very often you want to do a URL change, but you need some data from the server first. So now the router needs to know when it can actually change the view layer. So it has to go and fetch data from the server. But you already have a concept for doing that, and that's part of your controller layer. But now the router does the same thing, and again, now we have two things instead of one thing or concept to think about. And when the router gets a response, it will be able to do the changes in the view layer, but you also want to store that state. So now the router also has to talk to your controller layer, so it can handle this data from the server and put it into your model layer and store it there. So it's this thing that the router suddenly does the same job as this architecture already has concepts for. So it just gets more complex, unnecessarily complex, in my opinion. So I've been thinking about this idea where, what if the address bar was just an input? Well, basically it would work much like a view. So your address bar would be a view with an input, and that view would listen to changes on the input, and whenever there's a change, a URL change, it would tell the controller layer about this change, and there would be a state change flow going on, like converting that URL into some state changes, maybe talk to the server and stuff like that, and store that in the model layer, and then the view layer would be able to update itself. The good thing about this is now this works exactly like the rest of your application. So it's a lot easier to reason about this, and now you just have one concept for doing state changes, being a URL or anything else. And again, if you store the URL inside the model layer and you change that URL by doing something else, that will be actually reflected in the address bar, just like a normal input. So I think there's a lot of cool stuff. Well, now we have a lot more freedom to do routing in different ways, and I'm really excited to see if this concept will evolve, and we will find really awesome ways to handle URLs in regards of state. But what we're going to do now is look at some code. First, we're going to look at a little project which actually kind of converts the address bar to a normal input. And then we're going to look at a cerebral implementation using that library. And yes, let's just get going here. So I have this application running, yes. And if I click foo, oops, now it's from the beginning. So if I click foo, we see the URL changes. If I click the other foo, it can't get it because the backend doesn't have that URL. So what we're going to do now is jump into Addressbar demo here, and we're going to import this Addressbar from Addressbar. And imagine this being actually part of the browser. So it's a global, it could be like a global thing, like location. And the thing is that this is an input, so we can use add event listener, and we get an event, and we can log out the URL here. Target value. Okay. So when this refreshes now, and I click foo, we can see that we get the URL in the console. And if I click the other foo, the same thing happens again. Like we don't have this route, and yeah. But what we're going to do now is use something that you probably know already, Preventable. So with a normal input, you would prevent the keys from actually being hit. But now we're going to prevent the address bar from updating itself. So let's see if it's updated. If I now click foo, I do get the URL change, but the address bar doesn't update. And the same thing now actually happens when I go to any other route. And even if I go up to the address bar here and I try to type something, it doesn't update. So now we have effectively taken control of the address bar. So what I can do now instead is, okay, we're preventing the input, but we're going to set it anyway. So addressbar.value is event target.value. So if we save this now and it refreshes, it should update as normal again. But what's really nice now is that we're preventing the default behavior. So if I now press foo, I get the URL foo and it changes. So now it doesn't go and do a normal fetch as it normally would. So now we have taken control of the address bar. And that is basically what I wanted to show you in regards of this little library. This is basically all it does. It just takes control of the address bar. So the thing we are going to do now is that instead of just setting the value again, we are actually going to trigger state changes in our application. So if I close this now and we go to the route demo instead, let's see, I can start. Let's see what happens here now. And there we are. Okay, so I just have this simple application where we have home and admin. So we are going to change between two different pages here. And I have prepared some code here. And most interestingly might be the app here. Because what we're going to do is we're going to grab a title and the current page from the state, and we're going to render the page and based on the state. And we're also going to render the title based on the state. So what we're going to hook up now is this, this address bar, and we are going to create some logic that will transform the URL into some state changes. This will be fun. Let's see, we got our controller here, and we are in main. Okay, so let's start. Let's bring in the address bar first. Address bar, and what we want to do is you don't have to use add event listener, you can also use on. So I will use that instead. So let us first go in and prevent default behavior here. Just like that. And what we're also going to do is, like normally with React, you have an input, you listen to changes, but you also insert data into it when there's a state change. So what we're going to do here is, on the controller, we are going to also listen to change, and we are going to set the value of the address bar by grabbing the URL from our state store. So whenever we update the URL in our state store, it will be reflected in the address bar. So now we have this one-way flow that that Flux learned us. Okay, so now we have that in place. What we want to do now is actually act upon these changes. So what we're going to do with Cerebral is, of course, to trigger a signal. And we're going to create a single signal for handling URL changes. And that signal is going to be called controller signals URL changed. And we're going to pass in the URL, which is the target value, just like that. And then we have to create this signal. It's called URL changed. And what we want to do here, as I said, we get a URL and we want to transform that into some state. So we can use an action for that. And we're also going to use a small library called URL mapper. And instead of explaining it, let's just do this and you will understand. So this URL mapper takes a string, which is a URL, and it just converts it, or it will trigger, I just said that I will show you, so let me just do that. What we're going to do first is add a service to that, and we'll just call it route. And that will be this small library called URL mapper. Okay, so now that service will be available to our application. And what we're going to do is trigger an action. Let me import route from actions.js. Okay, so let's create that action now. Route.js function route, and that will get an input, some state, output, and services. Okay, first of all, this action will get an input, and that is the URL. So we want to set that URL into our state store. Input.url. Okay, just to make sure, in the main here, we trigger URL change with the URL. So we're just setting that into our state store. And then we're going to use this services route, and we are going to give it the URL. And the second argument is an object. And this object is like how you would think about a traditional router. So I will say that when I hit the home URL, I'm going to send the signal to an output called home. And when I hit admin, I'm going to send to an output called admin. I have to define these outputs, so I will do that now. Home and admin. And then we of course have to export this route. And now we have basically built our logic for transitioning, or the first instance of transitioning a URL to some state changes. And now we actually have to do the state changes. So let's save that, and let's continue on our signal. So let me just clean this up a little bit, like that. Okay, so now we have the route, and it can have multiple outputs. So I will put an object here, and one of those outputs was home, and the other one was admin. So now I can import a couple of more from actions set page. Set page and set title are actually factories. So I will actually call them and get an action in return. So when I hit home, I want to set page to home, and I want to set title to welcome, like that. And when I go to admin, I want to set page to admin, and I want to set title to something awesome, just like that. Okay, so now I have defined what state changes should be done on the specific URLs. And inside here, I could define AJAX requests and all that good stuff. So let's save that now. What I also want to tell you here is that, of course, I could do like messages, ID, and what you normally would do. Okay, so now we got that working. I think maybe we are ready to show this off. Let's save it and see what happens. If I now hit admin, yeah, it works. Nice. And I hit home, and we are back. Okay, so maybe we should just go through this. So what happens now is that I listen to the address bar, and then I prevent the default behavior, and I trigger a signal that the URL has changed, and I pass in the URL. This signal has an action called route, and that is what actually transforms this string, this URL string, into different outputs. So we have a home output and an admin output. And when it hits either of them, it will run these sets of actions, which will just change the current page state and the title state. So when the app receives updates on this state, it will render again, and with the CSS transition group, it gets that nice effect. So it's really easy to do transitions, and here you could do crazy stuff. But again, it just renders, and it grabs a new state and renders normally. And this is exactly how you would do with all other state. And this is what's so important, is that you have just one concept. And that is a view layer. You do some state changes, you store it in a store or a model layer, and then the view layer will update based on that. There shouldn't be any difference in regards of changing the URL. It's just a state change like anything else. And now this was a pretty simple logic. And of course, we could do a lot more advanced stuff. But I just want to show you this first, and then I can make another video showing off more advanced routing, because especially with Cerebral, you can do lots of cool stuff with compositions and so on, to make it really easy to handle lots of complex routing stuff. Okay, so I hope that was helpful to you. Please check out Addressbar and this little URL mapper library. What I hope will happen is that the Addressbar will be like a basic component to do routing stuff. But URL mapper is just one way of handling a URL. And maybe there will be other ways to handle this. I don't know what, but it will be really exciting to see how we can handle the URL as not just changing out the view layer specifically like components, but we can do whatever we want. And that's really awesome. So, okay, that's all from me. Thanks for watching.